Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ecosysteming Podcast. I'm your host, Thom Ruhe of NC Idea, and today I am joined in the studio by, somebody that I would have just a few months ago introduced as one of our partners. As a matter of fact, we did a podcast almost a year ago where I introduced him as a partner, but now I get to introduce him as a colleague, and that is Tom Snyder, formerly of Riot, who is now a member of the NC Idea team. Tom, welcome. Thank you for joining me in the studio. I'm sure most viewers know who you are, but let's give everybody the advantage of knowing a little bit about you and your background. So before we jump into all the stuff we're going to talk about, the juicy bits, why don't you just start a little bit with some biographical CV type information?
No, absolutely. I've shared some of this before, but I'm just going to start this time with the fact that I'm an engineer. And I like solving problems. And I did it in the commercial space for years and years and years. But a little bit more than a decade ago, I kind of got tired of that. And in particular, the fact that you saw big companies make big money for unnamed investors and employees sometimes getting caught in the crossfire of stock buybacks and other kinds of things. And how do you help people who are actually doing the work to own more of their future? And entrepreneurship is where that's at. Small businesses run our economy, and so started a little organization called Riot back in 2014 to focus on that quest. How do you help people take control of their own destiny through technology, through entrepreneurship, through business ownership? They can climb income ladder, they can climb a wealth ladder, but it's hard to do it alone. And so providing services and support for that economy is important. As an engineer, though, I'm a techie. I love technology, and technology entrepreneurship is where the highest of wage jobs are. Those high wages trickle down through our economy and support the great places that we want to live, high quality places to live. And met you, back 10 years ago.
10 years ago
now, and love the mission of NC Idea, and we've been working together ever since. We're maybe a little bit more on the programmatic side of things. You're more on the capital stack, and it's been just a great partnership.
Well, speaking of that partnership, like I alluded to in the hot open here, there's been a change in kind of the dynamic of the partnership. I think we've tightened it. We've always been close partners. As a matter of fact, I pulled contracts and grants, and I think Riot was our most engaged ecosystem partner across the state. And I always like to say that if you ever need to understand truly what a person's priorities are or an organization's priorities are, you look at two things. How do they allocate their time and their resources or money, right? And in both cases, Riot was receiving the bulk of our time and resources, which made it very, very clear to me, you were an important partner, a trusted partner, right? And that was earned over time, 10 years in the working. That first ecosystem grant that we deployed through Riot, I looked it up. We had our first update check on that in January of 2017 with you and Larry, and that was just very cool to stroll down memory lane on that. But all that is to say, we were so closely aligned that it finally made sense. And I got to give you the credit because you had, the idea. You approached me before I approached you to say, hey, maybe it makes sense if we go a little closer. And that really was the thinking and the impetus of what became a joint venture arrangement with the Wireless Research Center of Wake Forest and the great work they were doing. But let's be honest, we really didn't know about all the other work that WRC was doing. We knew about what Riot was doing, and you being, kind of under their nonprofit umbrella. So it made a lot of sense that if we brought you into the fold of NC Idea, also in doing so, kind of reconnect with the Wireless Research Center, right? And really help them in their mission, which is now, why don't you say what they're doing now during this transition, and then we'll jump off from there and what that means more broadly for the ecosystem development.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's been a great partnership for a very, very long time. And to your point, the Wireless Research Center is doing amazing work in advancing technology, advancing entrepreneurship, but with a stronger and stronger focus in recent times around what's called defense dual use. It is, as everyone may know, or maybe you don't, the greatest percentage of R&D funding in the United States from the federal government is in the defense sector. But defense doesn't necessarily just mean like bullets and missiles. It means healthcare technologies. It means agriculture. It means a lot of things in energy and transportation and other fields. And the WRC really is leading an initiative. And at the same time that we announced our partnership and coming together with the joint venture, the Wireless Center also announced the launch of a new entity called Riot Labs. And this initiative is really to capitalize on this opportunity to kind of tap into those really, really big budgets, but to have profound impact, not just for our national defense, which is very important, but at the time we need these technologies, they need to be available. And that's through having commercial entities to provide them. That's about entrepreneurship. That's about startups. And so, that's where this dual use piece comes into play, and the ability that, in the same way the government created ARPANET, which became the internet, we don't think of that as a defense technology. GPS, we don't think of that as a defense technology. Defense applications, but that's dual use, and that's
Right.
really the focus going to the future.
I heard you recently say, and it was a really cool piece of trivia, that there's only 2 states in the nation that have military bases representing all of the armed forces.
That's correct.
And, spoiler alert, one of them is that one. And I don't know if you'd given me 5 tries if I would have guessed the second one. After I heard you say it, because, the tricky one for a lot of them might be, I think, the Coast Guard would be the tricky one, right? I mean, you can imagine, even in the interior of the country, you've got Air Force, because people forget about what used to be Strategic Air Command. Those are those holes in the ground that have these little metal tubes that we don't want to talk about in polite conversation. But Hawaii, I think, is what you said was the other state.
That's the other state, yeah. And sometimes people get tripped up on Space Force as well.
Oh, that's right.
But Hawaii and North Carolina.
Yeah, that's very cool, which is to say, we probably have greater advantage than a lot of other states if we're pursuing these dual-use defense-related. And if I'm also remembering correctly, you were saying, that all being said, like, we're kind of in the middle of the country, like middle of the pack if you looked at this as an industry sector, we're kind of in the middle. So considering the asset base we have, I think it's fair to say, and I'm not trying to, be prickly when I say this, but like we're underperforming for what is here to work with.
There is significant untapped potential. Geographically, there's advantages. In fact, back when the U.S. highway system was rolled out, North Carolina, being kind of at the middle of the eastern seaboard, was where more highways were set up for planes to land on, to deploy and mobilize equipment and infrastructure by design. So strategically, the government one time said, this is where the defense hub for the eastern part of the United States needs to be. The largest military base in the world in Fort Bragg is here in North Carolina. There's lots and lots of assets, both geographic, infrastructure, and yet North Carolina only represents the 50th percentile, about number 25 in the U.S. for states for federal military funding, and that's the opportunity to tap into.
So clearly there's room
Yeah.
to move up. All right, so we talked about that, and I think that's exciting, and again, we're going to support the WRC as they pursue that and some other organizations like the Critical Tech Alliance. It seems like we've collectively awoken to the opportunity in that, but that's like one piece of a broader economic development portfolio. So you and I are on the front lines of just like talking at the macro level about economic development. At the risk of stating the obvious, these are crazy times, AI, quantum, other things. As we think about, together, stronger, more capable to do, and we've said always in our lens of our work that we're really working to redefine economic development through the lens of equitable entrepreneurship, of course, but in very real sense, industry sector sense, other kind of assets that we have to deploy and work with. Where are we going? Like what is the next 5-year horizon in economic development?
It's a good question. It's something I think about a lot. As kind of a builder and engineer, I get really excited to think about infrastructure. And so if you go back to the rise of manufacturing, infrastructure was things like railroads to be able to transport the freight. It was power from rivers and things to power the factories. And certainly kind of utility type infrastructure matters. Today, what does that mean? That means broadband in every community, whether it's a rural community or urban community. We need to have really, really good broadband. But in particular, in this point where we're entering what we call the data economy, that's where this AI and quantum and all sits. We have this ability now to digitize the worlds that we live in through sensors, through cameras, through all kinds of things, and use that information in real time to solve problems that have never been solved before. To be able to have a wearable health monitor that can monitor my health in real time and maybe intervene if it looks like I'm spiking towards a heart attack or something. Like, that is real-time automation of data. That's different than going to the doctor's office twice a year and getting 2 data points and thinking you can manage your health in that way, right? And so there's those analogs across everything. To capture that economy, one, it can be done from anywhere if there is broadband infrastructure and if there is entrepreneurial infrastructure. And that's something that I like to talk about. We can spend some time here. Entrepreneurial infrastructure are accelerator programs. They're co-working spaces. They are building the networking community both in person and digitally to connect to resources that you might need across the business landscape and across the technology landscape.
I make sure I'm understanding you, because what I didn't hear you say as we're thinking about redefining economic development is, attracting more big companies to move here with big gift baskets of tax giveaways.
The biggest change, I think, right now is that because people can work from anywhere and there are distributed teams, economic development is going to look much more like creating places that people want to live rather than creating places where someone can find a job. Because the technical capabilities of AI are such that narrow technical jobs will increasingly be automated in the future. Not tomorrow, don't lose sleep tonight over it, but over time, things that are really technical, like a doctor following a protocol based on some data to make a diagnosis, that logic can be coded.
Sure.
A lawyer writing a contract, following the law, that logic can be coded. These are things that are a little scary, particularly in the white collar space. What entrepreneurs are really good at is understanding unmet needs in a market. They're good at building trust. They're good at persuasion and sales. They're good at kind of the creative aspects that can be augmented by using AI to do research and so on and so forth. But economic development is, how do you attract those entrepreneurs? How do you train those entrepreneurs and create places where they can connect with each other? The idea of, we're going to put a factory somewhere, we're going to attract a bunch of narrow technical jobs to an area, you're giving a lot of tax money away to a bunch of robots.
Oh man, you didn't use the words data center, but that sure sounds like what you just described. When you're saying place-based, right? I've been doing this long enough to have kind of come up with think tanks like Brookings, doing deep research on place-based economic development. Frankly, there's even shards of Richard Florida's creative class, work, if you remember that from back in the day, where he really talked about livable cities and walkable cities and being, attractive to certain percentage or type of the workforce. And it's nice to see it finally converging, because obviously I was just being silly when I suggested, the continuing of buffalo hunting, because I think, I might be optimistic here when I say I think that this has been changing, but I think people are starting finally, at long last, to understand the law of diminishing returns on that, right?
And we see real examples of what we're talking about, this 10-minute city kind of concept. We're seeing real examples. If you look in eastern North Carolina, for instance, Wilson is a city of about 50,000 residents, traditionally ag-centric community, and they have done well with some of the big game hunting. There's some advanced manufacturing for vaccines and other things happening in the area. But they made a decision a number of years ago. One, let's get broadband. Let's lay fiber to every single structure.
Yeah, that was genius by them.
In the city. Solve one piece of infrastructure. The city then said, let's open a co-working space. Let's bring in an accelerator program. There's construction cranes all over Wilson now. People have moved there. They've started companies. Pittsburgh, North Carolina, even smaller town, is on this journey. We're seeing small, mid-market rural communities very attractive to people to move, to start a family, to have kind of the lifestyle that they want to, and still be involved in this high-tech, high-wage industry.
How hard, I mean, you were very instrumental in working with us, some of the stuff we funded over the years, like the work in Wilson and a little more recently Pittsburgh. What was the genesis of that? I mean, was it just, for Wilson, was it just a byproduct? Okay, they led in broadband. I guess what I'm trying to suss out here is, how hard would this be in other communities? I mean, are they just the outliers? Were they, quote, the lucky ones? Or is this, if you take whatever, like the population core of the Wilson metro area, like how many more Wilsons could there be in the state of North Carolina? And not necessarily this exact same blueprint, right? Because you kind of got to lead with what you have. But is that feasible to replicate? Or is it just, okay, it was just luck of circumstances coming together?
Not only is it feasible to replicate, but in my view, it's necessary. There was a period in our history, back to, again, the manufacturing era, where globalization was starting to happen. There was a fundamental shift in the economy around, low-cost labor in Asia and so on and so forth. And there are some communities that said, you know what, we need to bring in internet infrastructure so that a knowledge economy can emerge. And there are other places that said, no, we're going to keep trying to fight for our factory. And we were familiar with the Rust Belt, right? The Rust Belt happened because not everyone adapted. In this data economy, there are going to be places that put in the kind of infrastructure we're talking about, because that is where the world is going, and there's places that don't. If anyone is out there and listening and interested, could my town or city do this? Yes, there are entrepreneurs everywhere, and particularly in rural communities. They don't use the word entrepreneur. They don't maybe use the word startup, but some of the most creative problem solvers I've ever met are in resource-constrained areas. So really what it comes down to, the reason that, say, the Wilsons or the Pittsburghs are leading, really just comes down to leadership and forward vision.
Yeah, those are great points, because I've been doing kind of the ec dev work in the nonprofit space, entrepreneurship for over 20 years now. And I've had the good fortune to do it in very challenging environments and locations, and very affluent and well to do. And the curious thing, you referenced the Rust Belt. I grew up in Northeast Ohio. Sometimes we would say jokingly, or we'd have to compete with Pittsburgh to say we were the buckle of the Rust Belt. And when it hit that bottom in the late 70s, going into the 80s and early 90s, that kind of like, wow, the world is passing us by. It was actually productive in catalyzing the political will, the philanthropic support, the economic development priorities, because they couldn't attract, big businesses regardless of how much money they gave away. And it weirdly made it, I don't want to say easier, because there's nothing easy about it, but boy, that just, when everybody sees like, wow, we're in a crisis mode, right? Then I come down to North Carolina, where, frankly, the portfolio that we have would be the envy of at least 40 of the 50 states in our country and countries around the world. But there's not the same sense of urgency. Like there's no clarion call that, oh, poop moment, like we got to do something. And it's just a weird dynamic that it seems that 10 years into it, I think we finally have converted some believers, right? When you see the data come out of the Secretary of State's office, for example, the report they issued a couple of years ago already that I refer to as kind of the silent bomb. I mean, it was a bombshell report. Absolutely makes the case for supporting entrepreneurship. all net new jobs created in this country are coming from startups, right? The amount of capital, private equity and otherwise, that we were importing into the state, right? 70% per our last annual survey of our funded companies that raised hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the good news, right? That's the top line. The subtitle is 70% out of state. So we can have maybe another podcast at a different time to talk about, like, what do funders outside our state see in our companies that are funding in the state doesn't see? But that's, like I said, that's for another time. But that's all happening. I just don't know what it's going to take to get to that tipping point, right? When it is the thing that our governors, regardless of party, right, get up there. Because right now it's still best state in the nation for doing business, yay. And that's all large company dynamics and things like that. When will we find, Thom, I need you to answer a hard question, okay? Less people think now that you're one on a team member, I can't ask hard questions. Here's the hard question. When will we begin to believe in ourselves and collectively, with our elected officials, strive to be the best state in the nation to start and grow high-impact companies? Easy question.
It's a super easy question. The way I'll answer it is, I believe if you teach basic entrepreneurship, it's find a problem in the market and solve that, because then the market wants to pay for it. Whose problem is vibrant and economically stable communities? Well, it's the public sectors, right? Now, private sector can participate and should participate. I think you use this term elected official in your question. That usually is where the problem is, in my view. The good news is you don't necessarily need to have them involved to get started. And if we create enough of the momentum, the elected officials will get on board. But the reason the old stale form of economic development is still happening is because elected officials care about a ribbon cutting. That's a media moment. They care about big numbers like the tax incentives. When you get down to the staff level in the public sector, they already get it. There is so much latent demand. Part of our strategy over the years has been, you work with the elected side of the house, but you don't let them stand in your way. You've just got to move it forward.
Let's give credit where it's due, because there is something that the elected officials of this state did not too long ago that you and I both are very bullish on, and rightfully so, and that was funding an effort called NC Innovation, right? The legislature put aside $500 million. Now that's corpus. Think of it as a fixed amount, so that's never going to get touched, but that's a good chunk of money that can earn a lot. And through those earnings, they are now, I think, redefining national best practices on tech transfer and commercialization. Namely, what's the coolest, we use the term IP, intellectual property. It's just basically technology. What is coming out of the universities that, kind of like the defense tech part of our conversation, right? Dual use, like it could be used to serve any problem, and take those ideas, from the bench, as they say, if it's high science, like our friends at First Flight, that's what they focus on. First Flight Venture Center is doing great work in taking, deep tech, high science, and bringing it into the market. With the NC Innovation effort, it seems like we're doing something similar, but more writ large to the whole university system in the state of North Carolina. But there's a missing piece to that, right? Because we're good at generating, and I think this is true of a lot of other states too, good at generating IP. But there's that missing, very important step. What is that step, Thomas?
There's this thing in university circles, academics will know this term, it's called the valley of death, which is a bunch of research effort has gone, and the research needs to have some tweaks, some modifications, more evolution to really be commercial ready. But the research is done, so the research grant is over. So how do you fund that missing middle? The federal government's run a program called the SBIR program for many, many years to help do that. In fact, North Carolina attracts between $170 and $220 million in SBIR funding every year. Well, right now, that hasn't been reauthorized by Congress anywhere in the country. We're fortunate to have this NC Innovation Program to kind of step in and provide some commercialization funding for emerging technologies, which, as we said before, emerging tech is what drives the economy. So that's a great advantage for North Carolina. I liken it this way. You said there's this corpus of funds that doesn't get touched, right? You have a corpus of funds for a pension plan, for example, that secures the financial security of folks after retirement. This is the same idea, but at the beginning, at the most productive phase.
Oh, that's cool.
Young companies create all net new jobs, right? So a corpus of public money to fund the early career of these companies, the early stage of these companies, when they are productive, and then they become the taxpayers that fill that corpus and grow it over time. Like, that's the way I think of it.
That's clever. I like that because it is. The model translates, right? And again, my beef is that for too many, the political tribalism gets in the way, and it becomes ideology on like the government can't be picking winners and losers and taking zero risk. And I get so tired when I'm feeling a little more salty. I kind of remind them that this little nation that you purport to be so proud of, how it got discovered, right? Was when a government, namely Queen Isabella, literally put up the crown jewels as collateral to fund this little guy and a few boats to, risk sailing into the abyss to discovering what we now call America, right? That was the original government-funded exploration discovery that led to some really big things, right? It's in the essence of the formation. And why shouldn't a government of the people, for the people, by the people, invest in ourselves? Why shouldn't we invest in ourselves, right?
And we do it in research.
Yeah.
But why don't we take it to the productive phase, right? And so I'll ask you a question. So if you looked at Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, Virginia, North Carolina, which one is the only state that doesn't do equity investing in startup companies?
Let me think about that. Could it be North Carolina?
There's an opportunity to fill. And I'm not saying that equity investment's the only piece of this, but by the way, those other states also support entrepreneurial support organizations. They help fund accelerators. They help fund the nonprofit community that is behind this in the same way that NCIDEA is.
And point of order, the state of North Carolina did at one time make equity investing. And there was one particular exit about 20, let's see now, we are 20 years old. So 23 years ago-ish, there was an exit of a tech company that created the first windfall that was the initial, became our first endowment. It was the corpus, the first amount. That's what created NCIDEA. And so sometimes, I'm in polite conversation and somebody will kind of give me that argument like, oh, we can't do that. It's, it's an anathema to what we stand for, blah, 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 blah. And then I just kind of sit back and go, well, that's how NCIDEA was born.
Yeah,
right.
$26 million later, the impact continues to grow.
And that's the part that, I don't know, to me it's also weird. And you mentioned all those other states, and we had many of those states together for our recent statewide ecosystem summit. And I don't know about you, but I was jealous, hearing them talk about, they were also very nice and flattering to us, saying, hey, we've got so much going on, and there's truth in that, but that's really because of density, right? We're more than twice the size of our cousins to the south, mainly South Carolina. So I think they're funding stuff like this that we wish we were doing more of in this state out of necessity. They see it out of as a competitive necessity to not lose ground in North Carolina. I'm not particularly keen on framing it as a competition. I understand it, and if that's a motivation you need in your state, right? Put up a different state as the boogeyman that we have to, go for, so be it. But to me, it's not really competitive, right? We all humanity benefits when we support more people realizing their entrepreneurial ambition.
I've always believed, you help people no matter where they are. But I will share, I really believe that in the future, the places that will be the most economically viable, the healthiest communities, will be the ones where people want to live. And when entrepreneurs are choosing where to live, they're going to perhaps choose states that have more resources than the ones not funding. And so in that sense, there is a competition. I'll leave it at that.
That's a great point. So let's just close on that point, right? What's it going to take to make North Carolina the state where people want to come and bring their talent? And I'm going to talk just a second longer so you can start thinking on that. But I'm going to add on to it as well. And I think this ties into the traditional economic development, because if we have a stronger, more robust entrepreneurial ecosystem in the state, and if I'm a very large company thinking about where I'm going to put down roots, the days of the old Bell Labs and, GE research, those are gone. R&D, by and large, is done through acquisition nowadays, right? So if I'm thinking about expanding, my corporate footprint to another state, I would do well to think about what's the entrepreneurial ecosystem in a particular state, because that may be how we grow, by acquiring firms that are doing really interesting things that are either directly on our technology or our platform, or tangential, or actually heading in the direction we are going to be going to, right? So they're already going to where the puck's going, and we can make up for lost time by going after them.
Yes to all of the above. I've spoken widely on this. Folks can look online and see the remarks I gave recently when we made our big announcement, get a lot of data about why, a company would want to put themselves in a place with these kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems. But I'm going to kind of answer your question a little bit in a different way. And I want to share something. I was listening recently on the radio to an interview with Oprah Winfrey. And she was talking with Maya Angelou, actually, about legacy, what legacy means. And I believe it was Maya Angelou. She shared something that I thought was really important. And this is something that those corporate investors might want to think about, high net worth individuals may want to think about, legislators are listening and may want to think about. But if you're looking at what are the investments that you can make that create legacy, getting your name on something, that ribbon cutting, whatever, that's ego. That's not legacy. Legacy is how many people did you touch? And the kinds of work that we do here at NC IDEA and at Riot before and so on, it's about creating that ecosystem where a big company can come and no matter what skill set they need, it's here because it's diverse. Whatever industry, it's diverse in North Carolina. Whatever resource you might need, expertise, that's about how can I make my investment that touches as many people as possible. That's legacy setting, and we would love folks to come in and join in that mission.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to wrap up on, and one that probably, because when you think of other states, a lot of states are known, they're kind of branded for certain verticals, right, or sectors. And one of the strengths of many that North Carolina has is we have broad spectrum. There's just about anything you could possibly need. There's some degree of concentration, expertise, skilled workforce, educational support systems, professional development, probably ecosystem partners that are catering to these specific sectors. And so, I think we're kind of that Swiss Army knife in that regard. And I think that should be a selling point. Frankly, that doesn't get, I think, hyped nearly enough. So with that said, closing thought, we've been collaborating for 10 years. We're going to be working together a lot closer now. I mean, you made the announcement, so there's no take-backsies at this point. What do you hope for the next 10 years?
I want to widen the funnel. I want more and more people to feel that they can be a part of this economy, not be scared off by the technology, not be scared by the AI and so on, but to learn that it's actually accessible. You can use it to change your trajectory, to change your future. I want to see a world where economic security comes to more people. When we have that, a lot of the kind of the instability, the chaos, the fear, the things that we're seeing writ large in society right now, all of that is rooted in economic security, and entrepreneurship, I think, is the clearest path to supporting the most people. Just want to do good work and continue to push towards that dream.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think I've said on many occasions, I think the world's greatest natural resource is the entrepreneurial potential of everyone, right? We just have to find the will, the resources, support the people that can help tap that, latent potential in all of us. And if we do that, I think we will have figured something out that really will go to the heart of human flourishing and make the world a much better and safer place where everybody feels vested in the collective outcome. So with that said, welcome aboard, brother. Happy to have you and Rachel, and looking forward to all the great things ahead. Couldn't be more happy for this, and frankly, more optimistic now than 10 years ago when I started on this little journey that brought us together. Thanks for joining us. Thank you all for listening to the pod. Feel free to check in. We've got many episodes. We've been doing this for a little bit. And as always, if you've got ideas for the pod, guest-wise or topic-wise, don't be shy. Be sure to let us know. We're happy to take it. I know this looks like a very professional thing that's very rigid, but you might be surprised to realize, no, we're kind of flexible in that regard. We like to eat our own dog food here at NC Idea and be entrepreneurial in everything we do. So let us hear from you if you have some ideas. And with that, I say adios.